Welcome again to Midweek Moments with St. John's. We are becoming better introduced to Emma and Nate Dove as they have moved here into the life of St. John's. Nate is serving on our ministry staff as our minister with youth and young adults. And Emma is a PhD student at the University of Virginia up in Charlottesville. And while she's a student at that school, she's not at that school. She's here in Charlotte, and she's learning how to do PhD studies during a pandemic. Aren't we all enjoying what all we're learning during this time as to how to live in distant ways? So, let me once again welcome to the conversation today, Emma and Nate. So one of the things that we have decided to explore is a community of faith. And you're going to be guiding us in a lot of this exploration, is how do we connect with youth and young adults of today and communicate with people who have been youth and have been young adults in other times. There's some similarities just between going through that passage of life cycle in youth and young adult that are similar, but there are also aspects that are very different. And we're going to need to communicate to people who have not been youth now and are not being young adults now. Yes, these things are just like what you went through, but this is very different. And so would you talk a little bit about and help some of us understand what are you all experiencing as young adults right now that your parents also experienced? But then how are you experiencing young adulthood in a way that's very different from how your parents experienced that piece of life?
Yeah. I think every generation, like you said, has the similarities, and that, you know, at least in terms of looking back at previous generations and comparing maybe how they were viewed similarly to the way that our generation is viewed, is that older generations have always looked at the younger generations as different, or is there something unique about them? They're challenging generation. They're entitled. They're privileged. They get away with whatever they want. They you know, our parents had to walk to school uphill both ways
in the snow
and the pouring rain, and
in Macon, Georgia.
Yeah, Macon doesn't actually get snow all that often, so nix that.
Yeah, but yeah, there's always a sense of that previous generations looking at younger generations differently, but also that I feel like every generation shares things in common in that they are always pushing the envelope. They're challenging the established norms. And one thing that our generation in particular has challenged is institutions, and the church has fallen into that category as an established institution that millennials have sort of wanted to push back against. And I think there are all sorts of different reasons for that, but that's something that you have to be mindful of when you are trying to minister or to engage young adults, is that we come from a starting point of, if you're an old institution, we don't trust you. So you have to build trust with young adults. And that takes work and effort to do that. I also think our generation came of age we grew up as the internet was unfolding. Mm-hmm. You know, I can't remember dial-up, but
you can't.
I can. Yeah,
oh, you can.
I can remember dial-up, but it rapidly progressed as I was aging until now. You know, we have fiber internet where we stream movies, and we grew up with technology rapidly exploding, and I think a lot of our lives have been centered around the internet and what the internet means, and I mean, the way that we consume information is largely from the internet.
And connect with one another.
Yeah. I've started thinking a few months ago about this interplay between the world in which I became an adult. I grew up as a child, a youth, and became an adult. I had to go to the world today the world comes to you.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I mean, it comes to me too, but for you all, you're really walking through youth and especially now young adult years where you need to go to the world. The world is right there on your cell phone. It's right there on the screen. And so I think that interplay is going to be very different too as we begin to explore in this laboratory of learning together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there are many things that characterize young people. They're not all the same. But I think certainly young folks, when I'm thinking about young folks our age who don't have didn't go to divinity school and aren't particularly that interested in church, I think that they want to feel that all of them desire community. Let me just preface it by saying I think that all young people want to find purpose and place in life, and that they want to be a part of a bigger story and want to engage civically with community and to make a difference within their communities. They want to have friends and they want to feel connected, but church isn't always the first first thing they go to when they.
That's right.
And there are many different reasons for that. But I think that what church can easily shoot itself in the foot by not providing spaces that are easy entry points for young adults that aren't just the Sunday morning worship time.
That's right.
Because if that's all you're providing, young folks our age who are skeptical of institutions and tradition, they're going to be really worried about walking into an institution on Sunday morning where the pastor's wearing a robe and there's pews and it feels
Right.
very rigid in some cases. Not saying that it is, but it could feel that way. And I think that if you're going to minister to young adults, you have to figure out how you can provide those entry points outside of the sanctuary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and they grew up with Harry Potter, so they like the robe piece.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now,
But you just have to give out robes to everyone.
That's
in that
right.
case.
and we should do
We all
that,
wear
and
robes.
scepters and stuff. So, part of the intriguing piece that I think is provided by this pandemic is it has allowed us to do some creative thought about how do you do church in creative ways, in ways outside the boundaries of norm. And so I look forward to, as we begin to re-enter, that point of re-entry when we come back into this, leave the orbit of the moon and come back. What have we learned during this time that makes it easier to transition into some creative approaches and language and so on? So I look forward to that. Well, thank you for that. So Emma, you mentioned earlier that you have been studying prayer books and medieval history and spirituality and these kinds of arenas and bringing pieces intersecting and interweaving. Would you explain to us a little bit about what you're studying in your PhD work, and how has this pandemic and now this logistical move to Charlotte framed that for you?
Sure. So I'm entering the third year of a PhD program, and my department is art history, and I study medieval art history and especially manuscripts made in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are a really long time period, so from about 500 to 1500, and I study stuff in the later section of that time period, so roughly between 1200 and 1500.
So you're focusing in on prior to the Reformation.
Yep. So
but
there's
there is
just
beginning
like
to
one
be
Christian
a
church.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's beginning to be. Sorry, what?
There's just beginning to be some questions asked, but they're not supposed to be asked.
Yeah, I would say questions are definitely being asked. So the reason that I study the books that I study, books of hours, is because a lot of them were made and used by women. And I would say that we can learn a lot about how women were finding themselves and expressing themselves and situating themselves within a religious culture where, they couldn't be leaders and were not always, put in positions of power. But you can find evidence for, women asserting themselves and asserting their importance and asserting their spiritual knowledge in the types of materials that I study, which I find really interesting. So there's some pushback, against church hierarchy happening.
Yeah.
You just have to go looking for it.
Yeah, so I look forward to learning from you and learning with you along this way. All right, so I want to ask you a couple of questions to sort of close out some time here. But one of these, I know both of you have been involved a little bit in this, but Nate, I'm more familiar with your work on this thing called Thanks Be to Pod.
Yeah.
How'd that develop? And explain to folks what that is. Oh, there we go. Oh, we have our own bumper stickers,
merchandise.
stickers.
So talking about young adults, I think young adults are characterized by certain attributes. We don't have cable. We stream all of our content. We are very eco-conscious or whatever. There's these certain things that characterize young adults, but one of them, across the board, I think that you can pretty much anybody in their from mid-30s to right out of college, you ask them if they're a young adult, then pretty much all of them listen to podcasts, I think.
Or at least have heard of podcasts.
Know about podcasts. So I feel like it's a medium that has definitely developed into something that people our age listen to on their way to work, when they're commuting. It's our primary source. It's one of my primary sources of information.
And also entertainment.
Yeah, and entertainment. So Thanks Be to Pod is a podcast that I developed with a friend of mine who grew up in a similar situation. Both of us are from evangelical backgrounds. We met our freshman year in college. We were working for a summer camp, a conservative summer camp. And post then, both of us went through our own experiences of having big questions about religion. And we stopped communicating with each other after that summer. Years later, while we were in divinity school, my friend reaches out to me and says, I see you're at Yale Divinity School. Are you a safe person to talk to about all of these questions I'm having? It's like, are you progressive? Is that what And I said, yes. And we started, we just rekindled. He was at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And so we rekindled a friendship that we had. And both of us we're the same age, and both of us deeply care about the church and spirituality, and I think recognize that people of the millennial generation want spiritual community, but don't know where to find it. And so the idea behind the podcast was not just to be another talking head podcast, but to highlight the stories of people finding that community and where that community is. And we've been on an indefinite hiatus with moving and that pandemic. But I think both of us are excited about me being in Charlotte and him being in Nashville and being in sort of cities that share a lot in common, and to be able to continue developing and featuring stories, but in a much more local way, I think.
Colby Long, your co-host, also just became a dad.
He is
for the first time.
So he's
so he's
a little out of pocket.
Well, he's entering a different kind of pandemic.
Right. Yeah. So he's definitely got a lot going on. But I think the idea behind the podcast was to do two things. One is to provide stories so other people listening can hear of people finding spiritual community, but also to push churches to do things,
Right.
To listen to young people, to listen to millennials in particular, and get out of the comfort zone a little bit. And there's no one right way to do that, but I think that there are a lot of different young people. I think there are churches doing all sorts of different things right now to try to figure out what they can do with young folks, and no one is doing it. There's no one particular right answer to the question of how do we get the 20-year-olds to come to church. But I do think there are ways to experiment and to innovate that will help. And so we're trying to find those things. Yeah.
Where do teenagers get their information today?
That's
TikTok.
a great question.
TikTok? Well, what are they going to do now?
40 days and I could have any TikTok. What's funny that you'd ask, because I think that going back to that question that you asked like 20 minutes ago now, or whatever session that is when we're done recording, youth ministry is changing so rapidly that when I was a youth, you just put an event on Facebook and people came. Because
Was Facebook a thing for you when you were a youth?
yeah,
Really?
yeah. It had become a thing, and a strong thing. Like it kind of exploded in my.
Yeah, it used to belong to young people.
Yes, but now it doesn't.
That's
You
right.
won't catch a teenager on Facebook, really. I mean, some of them have
Unless they're
Facebook.
checking up on their parents.
Yeah, they're there because it's Facebook to them is like LinkedIn. It's like, or you got to have a Facebook to look more established. But most teenagers aren't on Facebook, so you can't communication has changed. Whereas I think when I was in high school and college, I would see things on Facebook, events in college or news articles in college, and I would read them. And now that's not that way at all. So I think teenagers, at least, I can't speak for a 16-year-old, but at least from my observations, and like, teenagers aren't on Facebook, but they get news from other social media platforms. But I still think social media is probably the biggest source of
A
information.
couple of young people on a trip to New York City, it's been 2 or 3 years ago now, but I asked them, I said, where are you all? And they said, YouTube.
Yeah.
And they just
Yeah.
are watching one YouTube
Well, I do.
short film after another.
Yeah, I think YouTube, even YouTube, there are some social media platforms that transcend the millennial and the Generation Z. And YouTube is one of those. YouTube and Instagram, for whatever reason, tend to kind of be shared between, I see folks in Gen Z who are 10 years younger than me that use Instagram the same way that someone who is 26, 27 does. So, there's something about that medium that has captured both of them. But YouTube is also that way. I think just going through YouTube and seeing content, like my brother watches YouTube, and he watches and my brother's 16 years old, so he's consuming information off of YouTube.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great platform for churches to figure out, more so than the podcasting platform. I think YouTube is, especially right now in pandemic world.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, again, I want to say thank you to each of you for participating in this conversation, for introducing yourselves to the people of St. John's and beyond. And want to just ask you one more question, and that has to do with what is anything that you would want to just say to the people of St. John's? Here you've moved during this COVID-19 pandemic. We would have normally welcomed you on 2 or 3 Sundays and had a lunch, and everyone would have gotten acquainted with you in the halls. But we can't do that. So help them, something that you just want to say to the folks here, the youth, their parents, any age group, anybody.
Well, there are many things I would like to say. One, I still want that lunch whenever we get
Okay,
back
we'll do it. Done.
It is a unique situation, but I think even though we are slowly getting to know people in ways that are unique to the situation through email, through socially distanced visits, through, I mean, that we're doing it kind of piecemeal, really. Everybody that we have met has just been genuinely nice and kind and very excited about us being in Charlotte, and it just makes us all the more excited to be here. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for continuing the search process during the pandemic, and for the patience for us to get settled, because it has definitely been challenging to move and to get settled during this time. I mean, you probably feel similarly.
I do. Yeah, I love people so much, but I'm also an introvert. And so the way so far that we've been meeting individual families has been a great way to get to know people better, than those sort of like 2 to 3 minute touch point conversations that happen one after another at a sort of luncheon situation. And has also been a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, probably would not have done this had it not been for the pandemic. But what we've been doing is going to meet individually with families.
And want to continue.
Socially distanced. And that is, if you're for some reason you've stumbled across this video on YouTube and you're a new youth pastor and this is 2022 and you're watching this for some reason, go do that. Because that has been very helpful, because it's not a 2-minute conversation while you kind of jockey with other families that are all there and you're trying to meet everybody.
While you're
it's like an
holding
hour
a
long.
plate,
Yeah.
trying to balance
Yeah,
grapes
yeah.
and a sandwich.
It's like an hour-long conversation with the families that comprise the church, and that's been fantastic, and we're still doing that. And so I encourage people to definitely sign up.
Well, I know you all have had several opportunities so far to sit down with a youth and the family of that youth as well, and get acquainted that way with the family system. You've been able to be in small groups with some of the younger adults of the church. In a couple of situations, maybe where congregational leaders gathered for a Zoom call or a backyard gathering. So we're glad that you've been able to do that, and appreciate you all being willing to do that.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you for this time. There will be all kinds of other ways for us to introduce you to the church, but we just thought here at the end of the summer, before we begin a new church year, this might be a wonderful way to kind of begin this journey.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Welcome
Thank
you.
to St. John's.
Yeah.